I want to start with a question, and I want you to sit with it for a second before I give you the rest. The question is for anyone who has ever been told by a person who was supposed to be on their side that they did not belong. How long would you wait if someone told you every single time you saw them, every holiday, every birth, every threshold of your life, that you did not belong? Would you wait 14 years? Would you wait 1 year? Would you wait at all? My name is Noor Kashani. I am 41 years old. I have been married for 14 years. I have met my father-in-law, Harlan Whitlock, 11 times. And every one of those 11 times, he has said the same sentence. He said it at the rehearsal dinner before the flowers had wilted. He said it at our wedding, in the receiving line, while my mother was still crying into her tea. He said it at Thanksgiving twice, once in 2014 and once in 2019, both times while passing the cranberry sauce, both times with the same half smile, both times with his hand already reaching for the next plate. He said it in the hallway of a hospital in Pittsburgh, while I was in labor with our daughter, while the nurses were checking my dilation, while my husband was holding my hand and trying to remember the breathing exercises from the class we had taken on a Tuesday night in September. He said it on a Sunday in 2017 at a brunch in Sharon in a restaurant that no longer exists, while a server was setting down a basket of bread he had not asked for. He has said it 11 times. The sentence has not changed in 14 years. The sentence is this: Noor, you are a lovely addition to this family. You do not belong in boardrooms. I have not corrected him. I have not needed to. Until last Tuesday. Last Tuesday, in May, the Whitlock Steel Group, the company Harlan founded in 1962, the company he had run for 62 years, the company he had refused to modernize, the company he had personally vetoed a sale of in 2017, was acquired for $1.4 billion. It was acquired by a private equity consortium. The principal owner of the consortium was announced at a press conference in New York. And the principal owner, on a Tuesday in May on the cover of Bloomberg Markets in a cream blazer at the age of 41, was me. If you're here for the first time, I am glad you found this story. We are going to take our time with it. There is no rush tonight. Subscribe if you want more like this, and we will get to the part where everything changes, but first, the part where nothing changes. Let me back up. I need to take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is not where you think it is. The beginning is not last Tuesday. The beginning is not 2019, when I first saw the company's books on a screen in Pittsburgh and knew what I was going to do with the rest of my career. The beginning is not 2012, when I married Tobias in a small ceremony outside Pittsburgh with 47 guests and no father-in-law. The beginning is not even 2003, when my father died in a hospice room in Cleveland, 2 weeks before I was supposed to start at Carnegie Mellon. The beginning is 1979, in a kitchen in Tehran, when a metallurgist named Esfandiar Kashani told his 4-year-old daughter that the stars in the sky were not the only things that had names. The beginning is a kitchen table. The beginning is a pencil. The beginning is a sentence I have carried for 41 years. And the sentence is the one my father said to me in 2003, 2 weeks before I started at Carnegie Mellon, 2 weeks before I would become the first person in my family to attend an American university, 2 weeks before the last time I would ever hear his voice. The sentence was this: belong is a verb. You do not wait to be invited. I have not waited. I have, in fact, spent the last 14 years not waiting, in a very particular way, in a way I am going to tell you about, slowly, because the story deserves to be told slowly, and because the silence is the part that matters most. This is the story of how I became the quietest 22% in American steel. We are going to begin, properly, in 2012. At a wedding I did not know was also a war. The war did not start with a sentence. The war started with a card, in a cream envelope, with a name embossed in the corner, and the name was the name of a man who had refused to come to his own son's wedding. The sentence came later. The sentence always comes later. Tobias Whitlock was not, by any reasonable measure, the man his father wanted him to be. I want to be clear about this, because I have spent 14 years watching other people misunderstand my husband, and I have, somewhere along the way, stopped trying to correct them. Tobias is not a failure. Tobias is a high school history teacher. He teaches 10th grade world history at Taylor Alderdice High School in Pittsburgh. He gets to school at 7:15. He leaves at 4. He grades papers at the kitchen table until 10, and on Sunday afternoons he reads first-person accounts of the Civil War. And on Fridays, he drives Marin to swim practice in a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked windshield and a working defroster. He is paid $62,000 a year. He has never asked me for a raise. He has never asked me for anything except to be home for dinner, which I am almost every night, because the cost of not being home for dinner is a thing I will not pay. I met Tobias in 2010 at a Penn State, Michigan tailgate through a friend of mine named Sarah, who is no longer a friend, for reasons I will get to. Sarah had dated one of his roommates. We were introduced over a tray of hot dogs. I remember his hand was cold. I remember he apologized for the coldness of his hand. I remember thinking, in the kind of thought that does not quite belong to a Saturday afternoon, that I had never met a man who apologized for the temperature of his own body. He asked me what I did. I told him I worked in private equity, in the steel practice, at a firm in Pittsburgh. He said, "That sounds serious." I said, "It is." He said, "Do you like it?" I said, "I am very good at it." He nodded and he said, "Those are not the same thing." And I remember this very clearly. I remember thinking that I was going to marry him. Not that day, not that month. But by the end of the conversation, I had decided it, in the way you decide a thing when you have spent 28 years learning to recognize what you do not have. We were engaged in 2011. We married in 2012. The wedding was outside Pittsburgh, in October, in a small hall with wooden floors and a violinist who had learned the songs my mother wanted. My mother came from Cleveland, my aunts came from Cleveland. Tobias's brothers came, his sister-in-law came. 47 people, total. Tobias wore a dark blue suit he had bought on sale. I wore a cream dress I had ordered from a shop in New York that closed 2 years later. We said our vows. We had dinner. We danced once to a song my father had loved. Harlan Whitlock did not attend the wedding. He sent a card. I still have the card. It is in a drawer in our house, in a manila envelope, because I keep it the way you keep a piece of evidence. The card was cream, with his name embossed in the corner. The handwriting was small and precise. It said, and I am quoting exactly, because I have read it enough to have the words memorized. "Welcome to the family. Tobias has always chosen poorly. I hope you prove me wrong." I did not prove him wrong. I did not need to. I had already decided on the drive back from the venue, with the violinist's song still in my head, that the sentence was not for me. The sentence was for Tobias. The sentence was the only language Harlan had, and the language was a closed book, and I was not going to argue with a man who would not come to his own son's wedding over a woman he had met once. I did prove him something eventually, but proving him something, as we will get to, was not the same as proving him wrong. Drop me a comment if you have ever been welcomed into a family with a sentence that was meant for someone else. I read them. I do not always answer. But I read them. The first time Harlan said the sentence to me directly was the next summer, at a cookout in his backyard, in Sharon, under a maple tree. Tobias was at the grill. I was holding a glass of iced tea. Harlan walked over and he said, "Noor, you are a lovely addition to this family. You do not belong in boardrooms." And he walked away. I stood there for a long time. The iced tea was cold in my hand. The grill was making the sound that grills make in July. And I remember, in that moment, in that backyard, under that tree, I made a decision. Not the decision you think. Not the decision to fight him. The decision to wait. I had learned by then that you do not fight a man like Harlan on the ground he has chosen. You fight him on the ground he does not know is ground. I waited. My father, Esfandiar Kashani, was a metallurgist in Tehran. He had studied at Sharif University in the 1960s. He had a small laboratory in our apartment. He had, on the wall above the laboratory, a photograph of himself at 23 in a white lab coat holding a sample of high manganese tool steel he had helped refine for an Iranian oil pipeline. I have the photograph. It is on my desk. He is smiling. His hair is dark. His hands are clean. He emigrated in 1979. He came alone. He came with a suitcase and a copy of his degree and a letter from a man in Cleveland who had agreed to give him a job. He worked, for the first 11 years in this country, the night shift at a foundry in Cleveland. The foundry cast specialty steel for the automotive industry. The foundry was loud. The foundry was hot in the summer and freezing in the winter. The foundry, he told me once, was the first place in America where he had felt that his hands were useful. He came home in the mornings. He slept in the afternoons. He woke me up for school. He made me lunch. He checked my homework. He took me to school. He did not, for those 11 years, miss a single school day of mine. And I want you to understand what that means. That a man who worked from 10 at night to 6 in the morning, who had not slept more than 4 hours, who had not seen his own country in 11 years, who had not seen his wife in 11 years because she had not been able to get a visa, drove his daughter to school every morning and was there to pick her up every afternoon. When I was 9, he started teaching me to read engineering blueprints on the kitchen table. The kitchen table was small. The blueprints were large. We would spread them across the table and weigh the corners down with coffee mugs and a stapler and a salt shaker. He would point at a line and say, "This is the tolerance." He would point at another line and say, "This is the load." He would explain why the two could not be the same. He would explain in the language of a man who had learned English at 31 that the difference between a tolerance and a load was the difference between a thing that bends and a thing that breaks. I did not know at 9 that I was being taught to acquire a company. I knew I was being taught to read a drawing. In 2003, my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was October. He was 61. He had been in America for 24 years. He had not yet retired. He had not yet taken the trip to the Pacific Northwest he had been promising himself. He had not yet met his granddaughter, who would be born 7 years later. He was, when I last saw him, in a hospice room in Cleveland, in a bed with white sheets with a window that looked out onto a parking lot, and he was not, by then, able to speak very much. 2 weeks before I was supposed to start at Carnegie Mellon, 2 weeks before I would become the first person in my family to attend an American university, my mother called me at 11 at night and said, "Come now." I came now. I sat in the chair beside the bed. I held his hand. His hand was cold, the way Tobias's hand had been cold, but it was cold in a different way. Tobias's hand had been cold because he had been holding a cold drink. My father's hand was cold because the blood was leaving it. He said in the morning, in a voice I could barely hear, "Belong is a verb. You do not wait to be invited." He died the next day. I went to Carnegie Mellon. I did not wait to be invited. I have, in the years since, not waited to be invited to anything, and I want to tell you that this is not a figure of speech. I have not, in the 23 years since my father died, waited to be invited to graduate school, to a partnership, to a board, to a deal, to a press conference. I have, in the years since, learned that the room does not invite you. The room waits for you to walk in, and if you do not walk in, the room fills with someone else, and the someone else is very often less qualified than you are. Have you ever had a sentence that followed you your whole life? Not a motto, not a quote, a sentence from a person in a room that you have carried so long it has become the shape of you. Tell me in the comments. I will read every one. I graduated from Carnegie Mellon in 2007 with a degree in materials engineering. I went to Wharton for an MBA. I graduated from Wharton in 2010. I took a job in 2011 at a firm called Bessemer & Crawford, a steel-focused private equity firm in Pittsburgh. Bessemer & Crawford was, in the language of the industry, a regional shop. We did not buy the biggest companies. We bought the companies other people had decided were too small, too old, too regional, too unsexy. We bought steel companies, and we bought specialty alloy companies, and we bought the small foundries that supplied the automotive and the aerospace and the defense industries. We were, in the private equity world, the kind of firm that did not get invited to the big conferences. We got invited to the small ones. The small ones were better, the food was better, the conversation was better, the deals in the small rooms were better. I was at Bessemer & Crawford for 7 years. I left as a senior associate. I want to be clear about this. I did not leave as a partner. I left as a senior associate. I had been passed over for partner twice. The first time, in 2014, the partners' meeting had been, in the language of the firm, a close call. The second time, in 2017, the meeting had not even been a close call. I had been told, by a man I respected, that the firm was not ready for a female partner in the steel practice. I want to be clear about the word he used. He did not say not yet. He said, not ready. I asked him what would have to change. He said, the clients. I said, which clients? He said, Nicaragua with the Harlan Whitlocks. I did not make a scene. I thanked him for his honesty. I went home. I told Tobias. Tobias, who does not raise his voice, said, then we leave. And I said, we do not leave yet. We leave when I have somewhere to go. Tobias said, okay. Tobias has, in our marriage, almost never said no to me. This is not because he lacks opinions. It is because he trusts me to have already had the opinions he would have had. I joined Lindstrom Capital in 2018 as a partner. The founder of Lindstrom was a man named Eric Lindstrom, a Swede-Finn from Pittsburgh, who had sold his first fund in 1999 and had been, for the 20 years since, building a firm that did not look like the other firms. The firm had 4 partners. 3 of the 4 were women. The firm had, in 2018, 12 employees. By 2023, when the deal I am going to tell you about closed, the firm had 84 employees. Eric, who I now count as one of the 3 most important men in my professional life, said to me in my first interview, "We are not going to be the biggest. We are going to be the most useful." I said, "Useful to whom?" He said, "To the companies, to the employees, to the cities, to the families." I said, "What about the returns?" He said, "The returns come last. The returns always come last." I led the firm's steel and specialty alloys practice. I traveled in those years a lot. I went to Pittsburgh, to Cleveland, to Gary, to Birmingham, to Bethlehem, to the small towns in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana where the steel mills still stood. I went to Gary, Indiana in February. I went to Pueblo, Colorado in March. I went to a foundry in Weirton, West Virginia in the rain. I went to the offices of pension funds in Toronto and Hartford and Boston. I went to dinners in Manhattan that lasted 4 hours. I went to dinners in Pittsburgh that lasted 4 hours and cost $38 for 2. Tobias, during those years, was at home. Tobias was marking papers. Tobias was making dinner. Tobias was teaching his students that history is not the past. History is the present, the way we choose to interpret the present. Tobias was, in the language of our marriage, the steady thing. The steady thing does not get on the cover of Bloomberg. The steady thing does not give speeches at conferences. The steady thing shows up every morning at the kitchen table with a red pen and reads what a 16-year-old has written about the Treaty of Versailles and writes in the margin, "Good, push further. Why did Wilson fail?" I have, in the years since, often been asked how I have done what I have done. I have almost never given the honest answer, which is that I did it because of the man at the kitchen table with the red pen. Tobias is the reason I am the principal of a fund. Tobias is the reason I did not become the kind of principal who did not have a home to come back to. Tobias is the reason I do not have to perform steadiness. I just have it because he is the steady one. I am telling you this before I tell you about the deal. Because the deal would not have been possible without the kitchen table. The deal would not have been possible without a man who was not, by any measure, his father would have respected. A successful man. The deal was, in ways I am only now beginning to understand, his deal too. The deal was the deal of a marriage. We're going to talk in the next part about the dinner where the deal became possible. Stay with me. In 2019, Lindstrom Capital started tracking Whitlock Steel. I want to tell you how this happened because the way it happened is the way everything in this story happens, slowly and then all at once, and in a way that no one, including me, was expecting. We were in 2019 looking for our next specialty alloys target. The specialty alloys market in 2019 was a market that other private equity firms had not paid much attention to. The other firms were in software. The other firms were in biotech. The other firms were in consumer brands. The specialty alloys market was, in the language of the industry, too industrial, too cyclical, too old, too unsexy. I had a different view. I had been at Bessemer and Crawford for 7 years. I had seen what specialty alloys could do in a downturn, in a recovery, in a structural shift. I had seen that the small foundries, the ones that other people thought were dying, were the ones that were, in fact, holding up the supply chains of the modern world. I had seen that the specialty alloys market was being consolidated, slowly, by the European players, and that the American players were being left behind. I had seen that the people who owned the American players were, in many cases, the same people who had founded the American players in 1962, and that the founders, by 2019, were 80 years old, and that the founders' children, in many cases, did not want to run foundries. The founders' children wanted to be in finance. The founders' children wanted to be in tech. The founders' children wanted to be in New York. I brought the idea to Eric in February of 2019. I said, I want to track the specialty alloys market for a year, and I want to come back to you with 3 potential targets. Eric said, how many targets? I said, 3. Eric said, pick the most unloved one. I picked Whitlock Steel. I want to tell you this very carefully. I did not, in February of 2019, pick Whitlock Steel because it was my father-in-law's company. I picked Whitlock Steel because of the 40 specialty alloy companies I looked at. Whitlock Steel had the most undervalued specialty product line, the high manganese tool steel line. I want to be clear about this. The high manganese tool steel line was, in 2019, a niche product. It was a niche product that other people had decided was going to disappear. It was a niche product that Harlan had personally vetoed the modernization of in 2014 in front of a board of directors in a meeting that I would later read the minutes of. The product was, in the language of the industry, stuck. The product was not stuck because the market had left it. The market had not left it. The product was stuck because the company had not invested in it. The product was stuck because the company had not retrained the workforce for it. The product was stuck because the founder, in 1962, had decided that this was the product line that was going to differentiate the company. And in 2014, the founder had decided that the product line was no longer worth differentiating. I read the 2014 board minutes. I read the 2015 board minutes. I read the 2016 board minutes. I read the 2017 board minutes, which included the minutes of the meeting in which Harlan had vetoed the Cleveland firm's minority investment. I read the 2018 and 2019 board minutes. I read the audit committee's rejection of 2 modernization proposals. I read the customer list. The customer list had not expanded since 1998. I read the equipment list. The blast furnaces were 1970s era. I read the workforce report. The workforce had an average tenure of 22 years and an average age of 54. The supply contracts were favorable, but the customers were getting older, and the customers' children did not want to be in steel. I wrote the investment thesis in November of 2019. I argued in the thesis that the specialty alloy portfolio was undervalued by a factor of 3. I argued that a private equity consortium could acquire the company, modernize the mills, and exit within 7 years for a 4.6 times return. I argued that the consortium needed a principal with operational steel experience. I was that principal. I also knew in November of 2019 that the principal owner of the consortium would be, once the deal closed, me. I did not tell Harlan. I did not tell Tobias. I did not tell Tobias because Tobias is a man who does not lie to his father, and I did not want to ask him to lie. I told him one sentence in November of 2019 at dinner in our kitchen, at the same table where my father had taught me to read blueprints. In the house we had bought in 2014 with a down payment that was half mine and half a small inheritance from my mother. I said, if a deal ever crosses my desk that involves your father's company, I want you to know I will recuse myself. Tobias put down his fork. He looked at me for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator was making the sound refrigerators make. The clock above the stove was ticking. He said, do not recuse yourself. He does not deserve that courtesy. I did not recuse myself. The rest, as they say, is finance. But it was not, as we will see, only finance. The investment thesis was, in the language of the firm, long. It was 47 pages. It had an executive summary, a market analysis, a competitive analysis, a customer analysis, a workforce analysis, a modernization plan, a financial model, an exit analysis, and a list of risks. The list of risks was 23 items long. I had read each item aloud to Eric on a Tuesday in December of 2019 in his office in Pittsburgh, with the door closed, and Eric had said at the end, it is a long list. I had said, it is. He had said, how many of the risks are about the company? I had said, 11. He had said, how many are about the family? I had said, 12. He had looked at me for a long time. He had said, and how are you going to manage the 12? I had said, I am going to not manage them. I am going to let them think I am not in the room. Eric said, can you do that? I said, I have been doing it for 7 years. He said, I do not think you understand what I am asking. I said, I do. I am asking you to let me sit on a board in a holding company with a name that is not mine and not let the family know I am the principal. He said, yes. I said, I know the language. I know the silences. I know the way they say we will think about it when they mean no. He said, and you are okay with that? I said, I am not okay with that. I am willing to do that. There is a difference. Eric nodded. Eric has, in the years I have known him, nodded at the end of almost every important conversation I have had with him. Eric nods the way other people sign documents. The nod is the contract. The investment committee approved the thesis in March of 2020. The vote was 4-1. The one was a partner named David, who had been at Lindstrom since 2003, who did not like the steel industry, who had once said, in a meeting I was not supposed to have heard, that the steel industry was a museum. David voted no because he did not like the steel industry. He did not know about the family. I had told Eric. Eric had told the legal team. The legal team had, in the language of the firm, set up a wall, a compliance measure to prevent the misuse of material non-public information. I am telling you this because the story is, in part, a story about the line between a corporate procedure and a moral posture, and the line is thinner than you think. The negotiations began in May of 2020. The negotiations were, in the language of the industry, long. They were, in fact, 18 months long. They were 18 months long because the Whitlock family, the family I had married into, and the family whose patriarch had said the sentence 11 times, did not want to sell. The Whitlock family was, in the language of its patriarch, a steel family. Harlan had said, in a board meeting in 2017, that a steel family does not sell its steel. I had read that line in the minutes. I had underlined it. I had, in the margin of the minutes, written a single word: eventually. The consortium, on our side, was led by me. I was the principal. I was the negotiator. I was the person who flew, in the 18 months of negotiations, 11 times to Sharon, Pennsylvania, 11 times to Pittsburgh, 8 times to New York, 4 times to London, and once to a small office in Singapore where the co-investor sat behind a glass desk and asked me, "Why this company?" I said, "Because the company is worth 3 times what the family thinks it is." He said, "And how do you know?" I said, "Because I have read every board minute since 1962. He said, "And you are not afraid of the family?" I said, "I am the family." He laughed. I did not. The co-investor was a man named Hung, a Singaporean Chinese investor who had made his money in shipping. On the wall of his office in Singapore hung a small painting of a steel mill at night, in winter, that he had bought at auction. Hung said, "Do you know the story of this painting?" I said, "I do not." He said, "A woman from Pittsburgh painted it in 1974. A steelman bought it, gave it to his son, and the son gave it to me in 2010 at a charity auction for $900. I said, Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because the man who gave it to me was a steelman's son, and the man who did not want it was a steelman's grandson, and the grandson now lives in Brooklyn and works in software." He looked at me. The grandson's name was Tobias. I did not know until that moment that Tobias had once owned a painting of a steel mill at night. I did not know that Tobias had, before he became a teacher, before he became a man who did not lie to his father, owned a piece of his family's history and had given it away. I did not, on the flight home, tell Tobias. I added to the financial model a single line: co-investor, confirmed, Singapore, Heng, $180 million. The financial model did not include the painting. The acquisition closed in November of 2023. The purchase price was $980 million. The purchase price was a 22% premium over the public market cap. The premium was a number I had argued for. In a meeting with Harlan's lawyers in a hotel conference room in Sharon on a Tuesday in October of 2023, with the windows looking out onto the steel mill, with the smoke coming up out of the stacks, with the sun coming down behind the stacks. And the smoke turned the color of cream, and the cream was the color of the blazer I would later wear on the cover of Bloomberg. And I want you to remember that, because the blazer was not an accident. The blazer was a decision. The blazer was a sentence. The blazer was, in the language of a woman who had been told she did not belong in boardrooms, the only sentence that needed to be said. The principal of the acquiring fund was Lindstrom Capital Partners Wharf, LP. The principal of the fund was me. The fund owned, after the closing, 22% of the new holding company. The new holding company was called Whitlock Specialty Holdings, LLC, a name I had also argued for, because the name was the name of the family, and the family would not refuse to sell to a company that carried its own name. The holding company was registered in Delaware. The remaining 78% was split among 3 pension funds and the Singapore co-investor. I sat on the board. I chaired the operations committee. I did not sit in the C-suite. I sat in the boardroom. The press release did not name individual investors. The press release said, and I am quoting exactly because I have a copy in a file at home, "Whitlock Specialty Holdings, LLC, a newly formed Delaware entity, has completed the acquisition of Whitlock Steel Group. The principal investors are U.S., are an international institutional capital." The press release did not say, "a 41-year-old woman of Iranian descent who married into the family." The press release did not say, "the daughter-in-law who has been told 11 times at 11 events over 14 years that she does not belong in boardrooms." The press release did not say, the woman whose father taught her to read blueprints on a kitchen table in Cleveland in 1991. The holding company's filings in Delaware listed the principal owner of the LP as a Delaware corporate trustee. The corporate trustee was a name on a paper. The corporate trustee was not me. The corporate trustee was a name I had chosen in a meeting with Eric and the legal team on a Wednesday in August of 2023 in a conference room with a window that looked out onto a parking lot in Pittsburgh. And I had chosen the name because the name was not my name, and because my name, in this context, was not an asset. My name was a complication. My name was a person who had been told 11 times that she did not belong in a particular kind of room. My name was a person who had, in the negotiation, been referred to by one of Harlan's lawyers as the wife. I had, in that moment, not corrected the lawyer. I had let the lawyer call me the wife. I had, in the negotiation, signed the documents as the wife. I had, in the negotiation, walked out of the room, gone to the bathroom, locked the door, and stood at the sink and looked at my face in the mirror and said, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "This is not over." I did not lie. I want to say this again because it matters. I did not lie. I did not, in any of the negotiations, in any of the documents, in any of the conversations, in any of the 11 meetings in Sharon, in any of the 4 meetings in New York, in any of the single meeting in London, say a thing that was not true. I did not disclose. There is a difference. The difference is the difference between a sentence that is not true and a sentence that is not said. The difference is the difference between a lie and a silence. The difference is, in the language of the law, a material omission. The difference is, in the language of my father, a verb. The verb is to wait. The verb is to belong. The verb is, in the language of a 41-year-old woman in a cream blazer, to walk into a room that did not invite you, to take the room, to leave the room better than you found it, and to do it without once raising your voice. There is a question I am asked, by friends, by colleagues, sometimes by strangers, and the question is, how do you sit at a board table in a holding company with a family that has not invited you and not say your name? I will tell you in the next part how. The answer is not what you think. In 2024, I executed the modernization plan. I want to tell you about the modernization plan because the modernization plan is, in the language of the story, the part that matters. The acquisition was, in a sense, the easy part. The acquisition was, in the language of the industry, a financial event. The acquisition was, in the language of the family, a sale. The acquisition was, in the language of the workforce, a change. The modernization plan was, in the language of the steel mills, the work. I hired, in March of 2024, a new chief executive officer. Her name was Dr. Amani Okafor. She is Nigerian-American. She had studied metallurgical engineering at Stanford. She had run specialty steel at Nucor for 9 years. She is, in the language of the industry, a steel person. She is also, in the language of the family, a Black woman. Harlan had, in 62 years of running Whitlock Steel, never had a female chief executive. He had never had a female chief financial officer. He had never, in his public remarks, acknowledged a female engineer. I am not telling you that Harlan is a racist. I am telling you that Harlan is a man of his time, and his time was a time in which a Black woman was not, in his world, a person who ran steel mills. I hired Imani not to make a point. I hired Imani because she was the best person for the job. The fact that the reason happened to make a point is, in the language of the story, a coincidence. I hired, in May of 2024, a new chief commercial officer. Her name was Ji-Young Park. She is Korean-American. She had run supply chain at a specialty alloys distributor in Portland for 7 years. She had, in her previous role, cut delivery times by 40% and opened 3 new international markets. She spoke fluently Korean, English, Mandarin, and Japanese. She renegotiated, in person, in the customer's language, every customer contract. She is the person who, in 2024, opened the Japanese market for Whitlock's high manganese tool steel line. The Japanese market would, in 2025, become the buyer of the entire company. Ji-Young did not, in 2024, know this. I did not, in 2024, know this. We were doing the work. The work had a way of becoming the future. I closed, in August of 2024, the 1970s-era blast furnace in Sharon. The blast furnace had been, in the language of the workforce, the old girl. The old girl had been running for 48 years. The old girl had, in her time, cast more specialty steel than any other blast furnace in Pennsylvania. The closing was a hard day. The workforce had, in some cases, fathers who had worked the old girl and grandfathers who had worked the old girl. I went to the closing. I stood in the morning on the catwalk with the heat coming up through the floor, and I watched the last batch of steel come out. The steel was, in the language of the foundry, hot short, the kind of steel that breaks if you bend it. The steel was the last steel the old girl would ever cast. I did not, on the catwalk, say anything. The workforce was looking at me, and I was looking at the steel, and the steel was the color of a cream blazer, and the color was, in the language of a woman who had been told she did not belong, a sentence. I built, in 2024, a new electric arc furnace in Butler, Pennsylvania. Butler is 47 miles north of Sharon. Butler is a small town. Butler has, since 1983, been trying to attract industry. Butler had, in 2024, an unemployment rate of 7.2%. We hired, in 2024, 231 people. We retrained, in 2024, every existing employee. We did not, in 2024, lay off a single employee. I want to be clear about this. We did not lay off a single employee. The people who had worked the old girl were retrained to work the new furnace. The retraining took, on average, 14 weeks. The retraining was paid. The retraining was, in the language of the workforce, a second chance. The high manganese tool steel line in 2024 grew revenue by 280% and became, in the language of the industry, the line to watch. The line to watch had, in 2014, been the line Harlan had vetoed in a board meeting, calling it, in the minutes, a sentimental attachment. The line to watch was, in 2024, the reason the Japanese consortium was going to write a check, and the reason the cover of Bloomberg Markets in May of 2026 was a woman in a cream blazer. The company posted, in 2024, its first $200 million year. The company had never, in 62 years, posted a $200 million year. The company had, in its best year, posted $171 million. The $200 million year was, in the language of the family, a surprise. The $200 million year was, in the language of the workforce, a vindication. The $200 million year was, in the language of a woman who had been told she did not belong in boardrooms, a sentence. The sentence was not a sentence Harlan had said. The sentence was a sentence the company had said in its revenues, in its margins, in its workforce, in its product lines, in its new markets. The sentence was, I was right. We are, I want to be honest with you, getting close to the part where the silence breaks. Stay with me. The next part is the part where the silence becomes the front page of Bloomberg. Last Tuesday, in May, Whitlock Specialty Holdings was acquired by Mitsuhama Tokushu Kogyo. Mitsuhama Tokushu Kogyo is a Japanese specialty steel consortium. Mitsuhama Tokushu Kogyo is, in the language of the industry, a strategic buyer. Strategic buyers are not financial buyers. Strategic buyers are companies. Strategic buyers do not pay a premium for a company because the company is undervalued. Strategic buyers pay a premium because the company is, in the language of the strategic buyer, a part of our future. Mitsuhama Tokushu Kogyo wanted, in 2026, to own a high manganese tool steel line. Mitsuhama Tokushu Kogyo had, in 2026, a need for a high manganese tool steel line. The high manganese tool steel line was, in 2026, in Butler, Pennsylvania, in a new electric arc furnace. Run by a workforce that had been retrained in a company that had been modernized, by a holding company that had been registered in Delaware, by a fund that had been founded in Pittsburgh, by a principal who had been told, 11 times, over 14 years, that she did not belong in boardrooms. The acquisition was for $1.4 billion. The acquisition was a 43% premium over Lindstrom's entry price. The entry price, in 2023, had been $980 million. The exit price in 2026 was $1.4 billion. The fund's return, net of fees and carry, was 4.6 times. The 4.6 times was, in the language of the firm, the number. The 4.6 times was, in the language of the story, the number I had written in the investment thesis, in November of 2019, on a Tuesday night, in our kitchen, in the house with the cracked windshield Subaru in the driveway. The 4.6 times had, in 2026, come true. The press day was, in the language of public relations, a controlled event. The controlled event began on a Tuesday in May at 9 in the morning in a conference room in New York in an office building on Madison Avenue. I wore a cream blazer. I wore the cream blazer because the cream blazer was the color of the smoke coming up out of the Sharon stacks on the day the deal had closed, in 2023, and the cream was the color of the last deal the old girl had cast, in 2024, and the cream was the color of a sentence I had been carrying in my closet since 2007, since Wharton, since the day I had decided I was going to be the kind of person who wore a blazer to a board meeting and did not apologize for being in the room. I wore the blazer. I did not apologize. The press conference was at 11. The press conference was in the same conference room. The press conference was attended by 12 journalists, 4 camera crews, 2 photographers, and 1 woman from Bloomberg Markets who was going to put me on the cover. I sat in the press conference, in a chair at a long table, with a microphone in front of me, with a glass of water to my left, with a copy of the press release to my right, with the cream blazer against the chair, with my hands on the table, with my face the face of a 41-year-old woman who had been told 11 times that she did not belong in this room. The article came out at 4. The article was on the cover. The cover was, in the language of magazines, a clean cover, a single face, a single headline, a single image. The face was my face. The headline was, "The Quietest 22% in American Steel." Tobias was not in the room when the article came out. Tobias was teaching. Tobias was, at 4 in the afternoon, on a Tuesday in May, in a classroom in Pittsburgh, in a high school, in a building named after a man who had been a steel executive, in a classroom with 31 students, in a classroom with a chalkboard, in a classroom with a window that looked out onto a parking lot, in a classroom where a 16-year-old was explaining, in writing, in a notebook, in pencil, why the Treaty of Versailles had failed. Tobias was, at 4 in the afternoon, on a Tuesday in May, doing the work. Tobias does not search my name on the internet. Tobias does not follow Bloomberg. Tobias does not follow the industry press. Tobias follows, on his phone, the AP history curriculum, the Taylor Alderdice swim team schedule, the weather in Pittsburgh, and a podcast about the Civil War. Tobias is, in the language of the story, not the audience. Tobias is, in the language of the story, the man at the kitchen table. Tobias texted me at 3:47 in the afternoon. I have the text. I have all the texts. The text said, "How was your day?" I replied, at 3:48, "Rather long." He said at 3:49, "Save the long for dinner." I saved it for dinner. Harlan called at 7:14 in the evening. I was in the kitchen, at the table where my father had taught me to read blueprints, the same table where, in 2019, I had told Tobias I was not going to recuse myself. The table was, in the language of the story, the witness. The phone rang. I knew before I answered who it was. Tobias was grading papers in the next room with his red pen, with his coffee, with Marin's swimming medal on the wall behind him. The medal had been won, in March, by a finger. Tobias was the only other person who would call at this hour, and Tobias was in the next room. I answered. Harlan did not say hello. He did not say my name. He said, "I read the article." I said, "I imagine you did." He said, "You bought my company." I said, "I bought a 22% interest in the company that bought your company. The buyers were a consortium. The consortium's principal was a fund. The fund's principal was me. The difference is the difference between a buyer and a backer. I was the backer. The buyer was a Japanese consortium. I am today the principal of a fund that no longer owns a company, because the fund was paid 3 hours ago for the company." There was a long silence. The silence was the silence I had been building since 2012, in the backyard, in 2019 when I wrote the investment thesis, in 2023 when I signed the documents as the wife. The silence was, in the language of a metallurgist's daughter, a material. The silence was a thing that had been alloyed, slowly, in a furnace, over 14 years, with the things that go into a thing that does not break. Then he said, "You don't belong in boardrooms." I said, "Father, I am in this boardroom because you are no longer in your boardroom. The decision was made for you, by a fund you thought was a Cleveland firm, by a woman you did not bother to read about, in a market you thought you still owned. The market does not, Father, belong to anyone. The market is a verb. The market does the work. The work is the work of the people who show up. I showed up. You did not. The market noticed. He said, "How could you do this to this family?" I said, "I did not do this to this family. I did this to your steel mills. I modernized them. I kept your employees. I hired a black woman as your chief executive officer. I hired a Korean American woman as your chief commercial officer. I kept your name. I did not take your name. I took your industry, and I improved it. The family is not the company, Father. You have, for 62 years, confused the two. I have not." He said nothing. I could hear faintly the sound of a television in his house. In Sharon, in the house where he had lived for 41 years. In the house where he had refused to come to our wedding. He hung up. "I did not call back. I will not call back. I have not, in 14 years, called back." I put the phone down on the table. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator was making the sound refrigerators make. The clock above the stove was ticking. A small white creamer was on the table in the same place it had been in 2019 on the night I had told Tobias I was not going to recuse myself. The creamer was, in the language of a woman who had been told she did not belong, a witness. Tobias came into the kitchen, from the den, with his red pen still in his hand, with his reading glasses still on his face. He sat down, across from me at the table. He did not ask who had called. He knew. I said, "He said the sentence." Tobias said, "I know." I said, "It was the 11th time." Tobias said, "I know." I said, "I am done with the sentence." Tobias put his hand, across the table, on my hand. His hand was warm, the temperature of a man who had been grading papers in a heated room. His hand was, in the language of a woman who had been told she did not belong, a sentence. The sentence was not a sentence Harlan had said. The sentence was a sentence Tobias had been saying in his own way for 14 years. The sentence was, "I am here." We sat for a long time in the kitchen in the quiet. The clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed, the phone was in my lap. The number on the phone was Harlan's number. The fact was, he had called. The fact was, she had not called back. The fact was, in the language of my father, a verb. We are going to close in the next part with the person this story was actually about. Stay with me. Marin is 9. She is named after a star. The star is Vega in the constellation Lyra, the brightest point of light in the summer sky over Pittsburgh for 60,000 years. Marin is not named after a man. Marin is not named after Harlan. Marin is not named after anyone in the Whitlock family. Marin does not know what her grandfather said in 2012 in the receiving line at our wedding. Marin does not know what her grandfather said in 2014 at Thanksgiving while passing the cranberry sauce. Marin does not know what her grandfather said in 2017 at a brunch in Sharon in a restaurant that no longer exists. Marin does not know what her grandfather said in 2019 in the hallway of a hospital while I was in labor, while the nurses were checking my dilation, while her father was holding my hand. Marin does not know what her grandfather said in May of 2026, on a Tuesday, on a phone, in Sharon, in the house he has lived in for 41 years. Marin does not know, and Marin will not until she is old enough know. When she is old enough, I am going to tell her the whole story. I am going to tell her that her grandfather said a sentence 11 times over 14 years, at 11 events, in 11 rooms, and that the sentence was wrong. I am going to tell her that the sentence was wrong because belonging is a verb. I am going to tell her that her mother, at 41, in a cream blazer on the cover of Bloomberg Markets on a Tuesday in May, became the principal of a fund that owned 22% of a specialty steel company, and that the company was acquired for $1.4 billion, and that the headline, in 2 words, was the only sentence that needed to be said. The headline was, "The quietest 22%?" I am going to tell her that her grandfather was not a bad man. I am going to tell her that he was a man of a time that is no longer the time. I am going to tell her that he built a company in 1962 and that the company, in 2026, was modernized by a black woman from Stanford, a Korean American woman from Portland, a Swede Finn from Pittsburgh, a Singaporean Chinese investor who once owned a painting of a steel mill at night, a high school history teacher who drove a 10-year-old Subaru, and a woman of Iranian descent who had been told 11 times that she did not belong. I am going to tell her that the people who modernized the company were the people her grandfather had not invited. in part because her grandfather had not known they were the people to invite. I am going to tell her, in that conversation, about a man in a kitchen in 1979 in Tehran who taught his daughter to read blueprints on a table weighed down with coffee mugs and a stapler. I am going to tell her that the man had a photograph on the wall of himself at 23 in a white lab coat, holding a sample of high manganese tool steel. I am going to tell her that the man in 2003 in a hospice room in Cleveland in a bed with white sheets had said to his daughter, 2 weeks before she started at Carnegie Mellon, a sentence. The sentence was, "Belong is a verb, you do not wait to be invited." I am going to tell her that the sentence is, in the end, the only sentence. I have, in the last hour, told you a story about a sentence and a company, and a man who hung up a phone, and a man who did not hang up a phone, and a daughter named after a star. I have told you the story of how I became the quietest 22% in American steel. The story, in the end, is not a story about a company. The story is a story about a kitchen table in Tehran in 1979 and a kitchen table in Pittsburgh in 2026. A kitchen table is, in the end, the only place where the work is done. I want to leave you with a question because the question is the one I have been asking myself. In the year since the article, in the year since the blazer, in the year since the phone call. The question is not, did I do the right thing? The question is not, would I do it again? The question is this. If you have been told by a person in a room that you do not belong, and you have been told by that person more than once in front of your children while you are in labor, while you're holding a glass of iced tea in his backyard in the summer, what is the verb you choose, and how long do you choose to wait, and what is the color of the blazer you wear on the day the wait ends? I would love to hear your answer. Thank you sincerely for being here tonight. This is a story I have carried for a long time, and the carrying is lighter now for the telling. If this story stayed with you, leave me one word in the comments. Just one word, the word the story made you think of. I will read every one. If you want more stories like this, quiet stories, slow stories, stories about rooms that did not invite you, and the people who walked into them anyway, subscribe to the channel. We are here every Sunday. Take care of yourselves. Take care of the people you love. And do not, when the room does not invite you, wait to be invited. Walk in. The room is yours. Good night.